Hey, hi everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. This, as I mentioned earlier, Liz Weaver, co-CEO of Tamarack, host of the webinar today. And as you know, we're going to be talking about design, application, and lessons learned. And before we get started, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Connor.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. If we can just go to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
We'd like to start off with land acknowledgement. So we'd like to begin this webinar by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous land. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I'm joining from Toronto, colonially known as Toronto. This land is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. By acknowledging these lands and their original stewards, I'm trying to position myself, a white settler, within the social, historical, political context embedded within the lands known as Canada, as well as commemorating Indigenous peoples' principal kinship to the land. So once again, thanks for joining us. And Liz, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Connor. So I'm going to introduce Cameron to everybody on the webinar. For those of you that have joined us through the series, you know Cameron already, but for those of you that are new, we'll go through quick introductions. I'm really excited to be in this final webinar in this series, and now we'll have to think about Cameron, what comes next after this. So Cameron Norman is a professional designer, psychologist, evaluator, and educator, and he's interested in the science and practice of innovation. Sensemaking, which is your company, started as a way for Cameron to share his thoughts on innovation, the process of creating, designing, implementing, and evaluating new ideas, and putting them out into the world. And it has now blossomed into over 500 posts and multiple learning channels. And Cameron, I was saying to you earlier before the webinar that I've just listened to all of your podcasts. I think you have 5 or 6 out right now, and they were really fabulous. So for those of you that haven't explored Cameron's podcast, you should. It would be a thing that I would recommend. Cameron is the principal and president of Sense Limited, an innovation consultancy that helps organizations to design, develop, deploy, and evaluate innovation in human systems, particularly in the health and social sectors. He's an adjunct professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And again, Cameron, welcome to this webinar. I know this is going to be a little bit of a different. Normally, it's a chat between you and me, and then questions at the end. But today, we're going to focus on taking folks through a case study. So probably more chatting of you than me, but it's going to be really interesting. So I'm going to throw it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. It's great to be here. I always look forward to our chats. They always go by so fast. They're always so interesting. And but as you said, this time is a little more of a chat with all of us together. It gives us a chance to explore some ideas around design. Anybody who's been joined us for the previous webinars, and it's okay if you haven't, but you've been exposed a little bit to this idea of this design helix, and we'll introduce that just again a little bit. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk through a case, because oftentimes what happens is that we will use examples, but sometimes people wonder, what exactly does this look like if I was to do this? People can get the kind of individual ideas, but what does it look like when we pull this all together? So what we're going to do today is go through an example of what this has looked like and what it means for the design helix, and then really open it up for a discussion. This is a chance for you to ask some questions, particularly if you've been to the other sessions, or if you've just got something that's burning from what's coming up today, to talk a little bit about how you can use this approach with the work that you're doing and the challenges. And we've got people from all across this country, North America, the world. We've got people in London. I mean, it's really interesting. So really, this is a chance for you to say, what would it look like for me and ask Liz and I.
Great. Hey, so we're going to be doing storytelling with design. But before we do that, we want to kind of review the design helix. So why don't you bring us through that again? And I'll pull up the helix slide so that you can walk us through that.
Sure thing. So obviously, for some of you who this is you've been to some of our previous webinars, you will have seen this again, but it's always a good reminder. So the design helix framework is something that I developed in working with design students, working with professionals in health services, working with my clients, just to help them a little bit, just to think about what goes into to design. Now, what it is it's based on experience, but it's also based on evidence. It's based on other frameworks, and it's a framework. It's not a recipe, but what it does is it's a good framework. It allows you to ask some questions about what are the things that I might need to do to be able to make a design work. So when you're starting out, is that there's really these two threads, and like everything that we make, is it's got some roots, some DNA, which is why we've got this visual like this. And really, it's these two major threads of imagination and production. And design really is all about weaving those two things together. So what we do is we have these multiple steps, and the case study today is we'll go through each one of these steps is starting to think a little bit about what's the problem at hand, thinking about how we perceive it, making sense of what it is that we're seeing, bring it to life, fitting it, playing with it, implementing it, and then sharing it with the world. But what's interesting about design is, and this is what is important, is that design is rarely ever done just once. Like you just do it one-off and that's it, you create something. Because, as we've talked a little bit in previous webinars, is that this is also about kind of fit and function and fit for purpose sort of thing. So sometimes we have the perfect design, everything works really well, but because the world's changing around us, all of a sudden what might have been really good for us a few months ago or a few years ago isn't so good now. The world's changed, things are changed. So we have to kind of keep designing. And that's really what the next slide is that this idea is that it's a constant move. Now there's a point at which we no longer need the thing that we're making. Making could be a program, could be a service, it could be a policy or a product. It could be any one of those things or some combination of them. So sometimes there's, what we probably are missing in this part of the diagram is a bit of off ramps, if you will, and on ramps. So you kind of come in there. But the idea behind this is that you've got lots of different design cycles. And one of the things that as a designer, which we all are, and I think we'll talk a little bit about that as we kind of go along, is that one of the things that I always was fascinated with when I got into design, I've got a background in psychology and public health, and started working with designers in my work, and I started to realize they approach things very differently. They don't assume they're going to get it right the first time, and they don't assume everything's all going to work out. And what they do is they play with it, and that's really what the design helix reflects that. But is that this idea that you're constantly iterating and growing and developing over time, just like we do as living systems, as communities, as individuals. So that's really what the design helix is all about.
Great. I think that's a really good grounding for everybody. So now we're going to dive into the case study. So over to you, Cameron.
Yeah. So this is an example. I was thinking about what would be a great way to highlight kind of what does this, we talked a little bit about the design helix in some of the previous webinars a little bit. I just introduced it. What does it actually look like in practice? So one of the cases that I'd like to share with you, partly because of who's attending and it might be relevant to you, is I had a chance to work with an organization a few years ago, and one of their areas of focus was on supporting arts-based engagement for things like anti-racism, anti-Islamophobia, those really around social justice issues. So their idea was to fund arts, and of course, anybody who's worked with the arts realize, as an artist, you have a vision, you have an idea of what it is that you might want to do, and you're using art to express a vision. And in this case, these artists are looking to try and make a difference. But the idea is that it was so, the question was, well, how do they make impact? I mean, it's a nice idea, but does it do any good? And so one of the things they contacted me was, I got this call one day. I'm sitting at work and I get a phone call, and I get a call from somebody who said, "Hi, I hear you might be able to help us." And I just asked and said, "Sure, well, tell me a little bit what you're doing." He said, "Well, we need a survey. I think we need a survey because we're doing this programming and we're supporting artists in this work, and we want to know what the impact is." So let's use that as our start point for the story, and go through the design helix and how things started. So again, started with a phone call, but as we go into the next slide here and we start to see that first step is that, if you think about it, is that imagination right there at the top. So one of the first things that I did was start to kind of implement this idea of discovery and uncovering things. So they said, "Oh, we need a survey." So I started asking some questions of them, and I often will take the assumption is, maybe they don't need a survey. They thought they needed a survey, and I didn't want to disabuse them of this. But what they wanted to do was I started to ask some questions a little bit about, what is it that you want? Why do you want a survey? Well, the answer is that we want to understand the impact of our work. And I said, okay, well, there's a lot of ways that you can do that. Oh, do you know how everything is run? And they said, well, not really. So anyway, what we did is we had a series of conversations. That's how I like to start, any of my engagements with this, but it's also how designers work, is that ask a lot of questions, because oftentimes we identify a problem and a solution, but sometimes our solution might be based on what we know already. It might not necessarily be on what's possible. And what design is really meant to do is to help us think a little bit about what's possible. I think we've heard that quote that's often attributed to Henry Ford. These days with internet quotes, you never know if somebody actually said this, but you may have heard the thing is that he once said that, if I built what my customers asked me, I would have built them I would have given them a faster horse. And what he did is he created a car, because what they said is they want to get places faster, but he saw things differently. I don't know if that's true, but the spirit of that is still kind of true. So one of the things I also do is pay attention to energy. Now, what that means is that what's exciting people? What are the problems that get their heart racing? What are the opportunities that get their heart racing? What's the part of the work that people really like? Because people are attracted to the things they're attracted to. So why not leverage that? The other thing was also looking at the assumptions. So this particular individual who I was talking to, they said, well, we want to use a survey. And I sort of asked them, I said, well, why do you want to use a survey? It was, well, that's what we know. That's how we understand impact is measured. Because I don't know if you've seen this in some of your work where you start out with the solution instead of actually the problem.
Yeah, I see that a lot, where people think that, we need to do a strategic planning process when in fact they might need another kind of process, right? It's really about marketing, or it's about something else than strategic planning. So yeah, we see that a lot at Tamarack for sure.
Yeah. They want to go here to there, but they have, because they have an idea, they have an answer in their head, and that's what they're going with. And sometimes you end up there. That's exactly what is needed, but oftentimes it's not. And so this is the kind of the fun part. This is that imagination part, getting people to imagine a little bit. But if we go to the next slide, so then we start in that loop around the production thing. And this stuff sometimes happens in sequence, but also sometimes in parallel. That's kind of just like the images, is what's not necessarily a linear process, but it's usually a set of steps. And the way the Helix works in practice is sometimes you spend a lot of time in one of these areas, and sometimes it's relatively quick. It depends on the problem. It depends on the circumstances, all kinds of reasons around this. So one of the things is that I started to reflect back to this individual who became, of course, a client and their team, and just ask them some different questions about what it was that they were interested in. And as we started to ask questions, I really encouraged them to ask questions. They started to go, well, what do we want to know? And then they started to realize, we can ask questions and get different answers to different things. And so it started to get them to think a lot about what impact meant. and what they could do. But the other thing we also did was start to think a little bit about those who were involved in this, because we're involved with artists. For example, that's who they were funding. And these artists care about the art that they create, but they also are passionate about seeing social change. So what did impact look like from their point of view? And so what we started to do was ask a lot of questions about what might this evaluation, if you want to call it that, what would an evaluation look like if you're an artist and you don't know anything about research methods? What might it look like from the perspective of the community who wants to come to see this art? And this was all kinds of art. They funded things like sculpture, dance, film, spoken word. It was everything. There really was limits on this. So what it did is it got us to think a lot about how a survey, for example, might fit or not fit into what it is that they wanted to do. And it's that kind of thing. And Liz, I'm sure in a lot of the work that you do, it's that questions, those asking questions at the beginning, which is so important to getting that change moving in a direction that's helpful.
Yeah, and I think it does open up the kind of perceiving, right? It opens up your sense of perception that maybe we could be asking different kind of questions, or maybe, what our funders want is one thing, but what we want is something else. And how do we appease both? Or what the artists want, is something else, to know something else. And then how do we create something that is it's kind of that user evaluation approach, user-based evaluation approach. So yeah.
And you're absolutely right, because it also depends on different people are going to care about different things in different ways. So if you're a funder, you might be more interested in certain types of accountability. If you're an artist, you're probably thinking, don't mess up with my art. Like, don't make me have to stop my performance to do a survey in the middle of something like that. What would that look like? That kind of thing. Yeah. So once we started to do this, we had a lot of data, and it wasn't a clear example of survey outcome. Now we're trying to figure out, well, what does this all mean? And that's where it got us to the next step. And that's really about sense making. And sense making, is one of those words that's really simple, and it also can be really big. And sometimes it's sense making, and sometimes it's together. And my blog, is all a bit of a twist on that name. But really what this is clarifying perspectives, because the answer isn't coming up with the one true perspective. It's as a designer, you're thinking about utility. What's going to be the most useful thing that fits with the values, the beliefs, also things like resources and time. And, wouldn't it be great to get into everyone's head who attends an art fair and understand what they're thinking? But, we only have so much time and energy to be able to do that. So, and how do we do that in a way that doesn't interfere with the work? These are the kind of things that we started to talk a little bit about. So some conversations as a group. So it wasn't just me. What I would do is to say, here's some examples of work that's been done elsewhere. Here's some things we might do. And then we all collectively started to think about, what might this look like? Now, one of the things that you often hear in design speak is this idea about asking questions like, how might we? And that's just a simple way of asking a question rather than presuming an answer, asking, how might we do something? So it gets us, a chance to that shared meaning. And, when you think about how much work we do often with communities, in communities, it's that shared meaning, which is what really kind of in many ways defines a community. When you think about it.
I think sense making is a really critical part of this, right? And it's sense to different parts of what you're trying to make sense of, right? Because what makes sense for one person might not make sense for somebody else, or they might have another interpretation of that. So I think thinking about who you're doing this for, what's the sense that they have around that, and what's that I always like to call it this 360 lens, right? How do we get to that 360 sense making?
Yeah, and one of the things that I always like to one of the reasons I love the term sense, which you'll see it in all the work I do, is that but is also is like asking like what helps people feel something. So when you're stuck and you're trying to figure out what pathway to take, this is where your gut comes in. There's a thing that gets you excited. If you have a whole bunch of opportunities in front of you, and then all of a sudden, there's some that really kind of get you excited, or some that really make you feel uncomfortable. Those are often things to pay attention to, in our work. But the next thing is, and this is where the next step comes in, and this is the fun part. This is design as making. Because designers, the first part of this is really about just figuring out what's the problem we're trying to solve. What do we understand about it? How do we feel about it? Now it's a case of, okay, now we have to start making something. And what's interesting is, and this is very different, this is the approach I take. I encourage people to take this approach, but not everyone might do this. But the other thing that's really, I encourage people to do is do two things. One, tell stories. So talk about an experience or a story, and make things visual. So one of the things is, and the reason for that, stories, so both of those work hand in hand. What a story does is take things like data, like lots of bits of information, and you need to be able to tell a story. If you can't tell a story, there's probably an issue there, because stories are all about coherence. You can't, a good story has has a flow to it. You can't just keep going off randomly. It doesn't work that way. So what it does is it helps you bring everything together. What visual things do, we've heard that expression, get on the same page. And that is really what this is about, is when you start to visualize, people can start to look at things like, if you even look at this image on the screens, you can say, well, why is something big? Is it just because we drew it big, or is it because it's more important? Is it a certain color? Does that color have meaning? And, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But it allows us to have a whole bunch of different examples of visual examples. And one of the things that we did is, as we started to come up with ideas and start to look at all these things, the other thing that we did is that we actually literally would draw out what might this look like, because we were coming up with totally new ideas. We were trying to figure out, how do we get data from people, and how can we create a evaluation in this case? How do we create a evaluation that would work for a film, but also maybe an outdoor art sculpture? How could we do that? And we came up, literally would draw it out, and we would put sticky notes on the walls, and we do this, start to figure out what might this look like. So we actually got to a point where we could actually build it. So in fact, that's exactly what we did. They had one of their fundees or partners. We actually it was a film, had a film night, and we ran the model through it. And the model was, just to give you a sense of what it ended up being, was how could create a board where people could put their ideas on sticky notes. So it was portable, it was cost effective, it was very visual, and it would get people the right information, and it could be adapted over time. So that's really what we did. And it was amazing.
Yeah, I've done a similar thing. I was working with a group in Alberta, and we used, I don't know if you've ever used this tool, but it's called the story spine, right? And you start off with, it's a set of 7 steps, and you start off with your story, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened, and it walks you through each of the 7 steps. It's how Disney movies are actually, Disney stories are actually put together. So you can look it up, Story Spine, but we'll also send it out as a resource. And so I had the group split into 2 groups and use the Story Spine to tell the story of that organization, the history of that organization. And we got these radically different stories. And so then we went through Sensemaking, right? Which is, what are the themes that are emerging from these 2 different stories that are similar and different, right? And so it was quite interesting to go through that process, because at the end of it, we kind of had this shared story and the key moments that were important to both groups, right? And what that looked like. And so, yeah, the prototyping and using tools. I know your website is dense with tools around developing prototypes and animating and that kind of thing, sketching out, creating living histories, that kind of thing. So I find it so exciting to hear the story, bringing stories and pictures into the work that we're doing.
Yeah. Oh, that's incredible. We have to take a look at the story spine thing. But but it does get you into things. All of a sudden, you start to hear a story. I tell you a story about my experience, and you tell me a story about your experience. And all of a sudden, we start to realize how similar they are, but also the different things. Like what I might thought of as a challenge, you thought as an opportunity. And all of a sudden, and neither of those are right or wrong. It's just a case of going, oh, wait a second. There's a different way of seeing this. And as designers, what we're trying to do is really like make sure that we design something that's fit for those people that we're seeking to serve. So, it might make sense that, your story is more reflective of people that are using this service than mine, or elements of your story and elements of mine. So how can we create a new story of something together?
Yeah, really good. It kind of takes that sense making to the next level, right? And it really helps improve the prototype that you're trying to work on. Yeah. Okay, tinker and fit.
Tinker and fit. So I combined a couple of the next two slides are really going to be combining things because they're very similar. And sometimes the tinkering thing is that almost, as I said earlier, is that oftentimes with designers is they come around with this idea is that they make the assumption that things aren't going to work out well from the beginning. You don't want to make a total disaster, but it's only in the use of something that we can start to tell just exactly how things work. And that's exactly what happened. So there was a film night. We invited members of the community. We had an open town forum, and we let the artists kind of design things as they wanted, the filmmakers. And what we did is we designed this evaluation around it. And what we did is we evaluated the evaluation process. We looked at how did this whole thing work? And what we found was certain things worked very well. Certain things didn't work as well. So some people found it a little confusing. Certain aspects of what we were asking were a little confusing. So we took notes about that. We thought, how might we ask this a little bit differently? And do we need to ask things this way? Certain things worked really well. And then all of a sudden we also asked the people who came to the film, what did you think? So we got their ideas as well. And all of a sudden we started thinking there's some other things we could do. So what we did is we started to tinker with things. And then the key there was over time is running a prototype again. So tinker, get it, refine it, try it again. And so the idea behind this wasn't to do this big dramatic reveal, like we're all going to go away behind the scenes and we're going to have a big ta-da, here it is. Instead, it was, we're going to go behind the scenes. We're going to implement it small, in a very small kind of way, learn what we can learn, tinker, put it into another context, learn again, tinker, and then eventually get it to a point where it can become part of the standard application of this organization. But really what it was we gather some feedback from the prototyping, and then we just make some adjustments. The other thing that it also does is it gets us to think a little bit about, I've been there, and maybe we've all been there at times where you're chasing something, this thing you've always wanted to do, this outcome you've always wanted, something you want for your organization or yourself, and you finally achieve it. And you achieve it, and then you go, I thought it was going to be better than this. Or I thought it was going to be different. And you start to realize that maybe the outcome that you'd indexed on really wasn't as important as you thought it was. And this in this process, this allowed them to start to think a little bit about what really was important. So realize that some of our evaluation questions were right on, and some of them weren't. And so that could be adjusted.
And then the last step is this kind of implementation and sharing step, Cameron. So
yeah,
tell us about that.
Well, yeah. Well, so one of the things that people had said earlier on in the survey was, kind of that let's get going. This has already been going a long way, but there's a lot of times where, we design stuff. How many great ideas do we have, or even sketches, or even little prototypes that never see the light of day? And there's lots of reasons for that. But one of the things is how do you manage how do you implement this thing, put this into the world? And that often people get a little scared by that. Sometimes they're worried, what if it's not going to work? But this is what this whole iterative step of design always does. This is why you've got these braids in the DNA helix the way it is. But you want to put it in there. And then the other thing is you want to share it. You want to tell people about it, because our innovations, whether they're small ones or big ones, is sometimes we're not that good about sharing it. But the more we share that, the more feedback we get in terms of, here's some other ideas that you could do. Here's some things that are working well. So it's just feeds into the process. And it's really important to make sure that you take that idea, just like the image here, take the match, but light someone else's as well.
So in the case that you gave us, the example that you gave us for this arts-based organization, when they implemented, they learned some things, they tinkered, what were the ahas? What were some of the surprise moments that either the organization had or the artists had, or the funder had? Do you recall anything that stood out for you?
So one of the biggest things that stood out that they were shocked at was, so one of the challenges, of course, is that if you're doing an evaluation of sorts, so this was not designing the program, this was designing the evaluation, but the same process goes through, is that, artists aren't evaluators. And so the thinking was, well, how do we create this in a way of people that they're assuming have no solid knowledge of evaluation? They might have general knowledge, but that's about it. So one of the big ahas was, first of all, was they had thought that because this is a bit of an accountability exercise, evaluation is not usually the thing that people love a lot, but we designed this in a way that was really about learning. It wasn't about judgment, it was about learning. So that in itself one of the big lessons was the artists loved it. And the artists actually took a yes and approach. So what they hadn't expected was that these artists were like, this is great, and why don't let's tinker, let's play with it. So they ended up modifying it and even coming up with better ideas. So they had thought they had come up. So and this comes back to that sharing thing, by sharing it with them and opening up that conversation, they were kind of worried that the artists were going to go, okay, well, we'll do this. And yeah, maybe it's kind of interesting, but they loved it. They absolutely loved it. And that was really one of the big things that made a big impact, was having people be interested in this. Now, the interesting thing is that the implementation itself ended up becoming a little bit tricky because of timing and other factors that hadn't had anything to do with the design. So what they often did was let the artist kind of just do their own thing with this design, and sort of, they came up with their own sort of twist on it. So it also didn't get implemented as they expected, because of other, a lot of other reasons. But it, in the end, the kind of the big take home for this organization was, this is a process that can yield so much more. So if you think about this got artists engaged, it got them a lot more data, it got them more, quality data, all from asking an initial question is, can we get a survey? Mm-hmm. And just to see the difference. And that was just simply using this process.
So it's interesting, as I listen to you tell this kind of story, there's a lot in there that is good to unpack, right? There's the inquiry process, there's, not having assumptions. So really leaning into perception and discovery and uncovery and sense making. So there's all of that imagination kind of pieces to it. And then the actual animating, prototyping and fitting. As you go through, there are micro adjustments that are happening all the time, right? Yeah. And then what I heard you say is at the end we had to also deal with some things that we didn't know were going to happen, and because we had created enough of a good design, it could be delivered in different kinds of ways, in different kinds of modalities with different artists. So, and I love that. I heard you say we didn't think artists we're interested in evaluation, but I sometimes think that art is all about evaluation. So is that about shifting our mindsets a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, it is. Well, and I think, the answer was, interestingly, I think one of the reasons why artists might not have been interested in evaluation is because they're maybe not interested in the traditional evaluation. They don't want to have a survey. They don't want to do all that stuff. But the idea of learning about what you do, which is how I like to view evaluation, that's a different story. That's,
Yeah.
Most of the time is the things that we create, our designs, whether it's a program or even an organization, we value those a lot. That's not one of the reasons why we often don't change, is because we love them so much. This is a chance for us to learn about them. And most of us want to do good work. And so what really is, design and evaluation are very tightly coupled, because, this is maybe another webinar, but the idea is that oftentimes I get asked to do evaluation. That's part of the work I do. And I often have to tell people, I said, you want outcomes that your program isn't designed to achieve.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, we didn't realize it. That's why these things are so tightly coupled, is that if you want these outcomes, you've got to design it for that.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. Hey, so we said we would open it up.
Yeah.
I know we have a question in the chat box, or in the Q&A box, so I'm going to go to that. But also invite other people to go into the Q&A box and put in your other questions, or put them into the chat box. So here's a question from Elnaz. What is your recommendation for starting doing things with a design thinking lens for the cases that you have the knowledge, but the sector is not so used to or comfortable with the methods, or the approach? So what, in that early startup phase, how do you get people who say, oh, I want this, to broaden kind of their thinking about
that's a great question, Elnaz. So what I would say is that the way I would frame that is that this is a big part of me, is that take the smallest thing you can. Oftentimes I wouldn't advise an organization that's never had any experience with design, is maybe a little concerned about it or really unsure. Don't take your biggest flagship program and work on that in a big public way. Take something small, and it could be to figure out what's the smallest thing that you can do meaningfully that allows people to engage in this design process, and try that out. Because oftentimes there's not that much mysterious about design. There's some methods and stuff. I've got lots of things on my website for methods and tools and that, but most of it's stuff that we know deeply, but probably because of our institutions and all kinds of things, we've maybe got out of practice doing. So what I would say is break something down and say, what's a small thing that you can do? So it might be a lower risk thing. Oftentimes in organizations, we have these kind of projects we'd love to get done, but they're on the side of our desk. That's a great place to start. And my experience is that as people go through this and they start to feel comfortable trying things out and not having them not work, so that you lower the risk, and you open people up to learning, because there's not as much risk about not knowing something. So if you can do all of those things, what you're going to find is that you'll probably achieve a lot more, and then build on that. So if you can do a small thing, try it on a bigger part of your program, and kind of just like this whole thing about kind of keep doing it iterative. That's the best way that I would recommend.
So that whole notion of starting small and building, right? Or starting small, learning what's working, what's not working. Like, rather than do a big membership survey, take a smaller subset of your members and prototype, right?
Exactly.
And listen.
Exactly. Like, just if you're looking to get fit, I mean, it's wintertime, we're probably going to start wanting to get a little bit fitter. You say you want to start running, don't run a marathon the first time. Just try 5 minutes, 10 minutes, try that out, and then build up. And it's the exact same thing.
If anyone has any other questions, please put them into the chat box or into the Q&A, and I'll ask Connor to cover the chat box, and I'll cover off the Q&A. I have a question for you, Cameron, since we don't have any other questions right now. What of these, the parts of the Helix, what are the parts that you see people kind of freeze at because they get so far and then all of a sudden, oops, I don't know what the right strategy is, or I don't know what the right tool is. So where do they freeze? And then where can they find tools to help them get through that? And I know on your website, you have actually a toolkit for designers, don't you?
Yeah, I do. And so one of the things I would say is that, so there's a few spots. So one of them is actually the funnest part is ideas. And that's in that area of perceiving and discovery and sense making. So those kind of starting to, so number one, I would say, take some time to really ask some questions about what the key is. So at the very beginning, people often rush through it because they assume, again, kind of they often have an answer in their mind and they're trying to look to validate it. That's one of the areas. Second one is when you start to come up with some ideas, and that's that idea about the kind of the perception part and the the animation. And one of the things that I find is coming up with ideas is not difficult, but coming up with really good ideas come from lots of ideas. There's lots of scientific evidence that, if you look at great athletes, great scientists, great artists, all of them have one thing in common is they also have great numbers of failures and dropped projects and things like that because they try the most. So the key thing that I would often say is getting people to avoid the trap of going, oh, great, I've got 10 sticky notes out that, I've put 10 ideas out. Whew. You want to generate for volume. And those are the areas that people get really stuck at. And then the other thing is at the end, prototyping, interestingly enough, is one of the more complicated areas, but people get that pretty well. But it's putting it out into the world. It's the front and back ends that are really the toughest.
Oh, really interesting. Hey, Graham has a question here. So Graham's question is, curious about the importance of team skill set. I've been in a number of design sprints, and it's only afterwards where we realized we were missing a specific skill set that would have helped us avoid some of the painful missteps. Any advice? What would fit into this process, or where would fit be in this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to give you probably an unsatisfactory answer is that one of the benefits of particularly even the sprint idea, is that you get it over relatively quickly. So the idea is that you learn very quickly what your missing skill set is. This kind of comes back to that idea about trying to do the smallest problem set you can. Very often design sprints, even, best intentions are often still scoped too high and too big. So you end up learning things late, and there's nothing wrong with learning it. It's all good. But I mean, that idea that sometimes you might have been able to avoid some of those had you done something smaller in scale. But that also said is that one of the things is, this is where some imagination can come in. So at the very beginning, that start of that process, this is where that kind of perception stage kind of comes in, is trying to think about what might this look like from different perspectives. You can take that same perspective onto the design sprint. I mean, it gets kind of meta, but is in some ways you're designing the design process. So you might start to ask yourself in advance, go, well, what might it look like if we succeeded? Two really simple, great examples, pairs that you can ask is, what would unbridled success look like? And then behind that is like, what would it take to get there? But also, what would a catastrophic failure look like? There's a technique that I often use with clients, and I ask them to design the worst possible product possible that they want to do. And you think, really? But what it does is it starts to figure out what you're missing really easily, because you start to go, well, it won't, people won't like it. It'll be, it won't be very inclusive. It won't be. And then all of a sudden you start to figure out the things you might be missing, not just the things that you have.
Yeah, we do that at Tamarack as well. We use a liberating structures tool. that's a website for people. It's called TRIZ, right? Which is Design for the Worst Possible Outcome.
Okay. Yeah.
And you know, sometimes we'll take people in to say, what's the worst possible meeting that you can design, which is fun because we've all been to really bad meetings, right? So we all have that kind of kinesthetic experience, but it is that that really interesting thing. Connor, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thanks, Liz. We got a few questions in the chat box, so I thought we'd just get to those. So our first question is from Jane. And Jane asks, how do you build the patience for prototyping? I often find that enthusiasm and senior leadership commitment to the process stops there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things is trying to be very careful about how you frame design. I think design, it's really easy to, and I've been guilty of this too, is getting very excited by it, but is you really do need to have a little bit of patience in this. One of the ways to do that, though, is to use as an evaluative metric is learning. So don't evaluate based on products or production, but on learning. And you know, you think, well, what exactly is that? What that means is that you start to think about as you start to go through the prototyping process, constantly ask yourself, what are we learning through this? We might start to learn is that, you know, we're having some frustration. It's a harder problem to solve than we thought. Those kinds of things. By revealing that to senior leadership, I'd love to tell you it works all the time. It doesn't, but it does soften things. Oftentimes that the result is that, you know, senior leaderships will still be a little grumpy about the whole thing, but they'll be grumpy at the problem, not grumpy at the people. So that's what I would recommend, is that really try and make things as transparent as possible. What are we learning here? What's new information's coming up there? What problems are we finding? What problems are we solving?
Connor, do you have any more questions from the chat box? And we've only got a few more minutes left, so maybe we can squeeze in a couple more questions, but really quick answers. Connor?
Yes, thanks, Lizzie. And just a reminder, everyone, we will be sending all questions that we don't get an answer to Cameron directly, and we will also include those answers in the follow-up. So while we might not have time for the live discussion, we will make sure you get answers to those questions. So our next question is from Marag, and Marag asks, when time is pressure, what's the best way to get meaningful community engagement? Ideally, co-creation, in your experience.
Time. I don't want to say that you can't do anything without time, but time is probably among the most important variables that you can. The one thing that you can do is, this is where going for volume helps. If you're able to canvas people for ideas, do rapid ideation, prototyping, and synthesis. So if you can just do that, go for volume. So as long as you can canvas people, sometimes that can help. It's difficult to get really meaningful engagement without time. I realize that's always one of the biggest limiting factors outside of maybe money and people, but it's difficult. And so maybe the answer might be is, can you scope it a little smaller so that you can use time differently? Thanks,
Cameron. Connor, any more? One more question, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. I think we got time just for our question from Lynn. And is there such a thing as self-design, applying the design processes to oneself in approaching challenging issues?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So a great thing to look at, I'll share this in the post thing. Bruce Mao, famous designer, Canadian from Northern Ontario, he actually went through this entire process, had a bit of a midlife crisis, as people tend to do. And he started to realize he designs all kinds of stuff. And he said, well, what would it look like if I started to apply design and design thinking to myself? So he underwent this giant thing, and he's actually documented some of that stuff. So the answer is yes. Yes, you can. Anything that we create, we can apply design to, and which is most of the stuff. We can design our families. You know, again, being transparent and open and on, like, you know, it's not about being manipulative. We can just do it to ourselves. Absolutely.
And in fact, I think we do, right? Like we do it all the time, almost intuitively. We're designing things. You and I've had these conversations,
Yeah.
right? Hey, so Cameron, we're coming to the end of our time together. So once again, thank you from Tamarack for joining us. And thank everybody on the call for you also taking the time, I'm sure, in a really busy day to join us as well. And I know that I've learned a few things, and I'm going to keep in mind design for the smallest visible system. So I think the scope and scale of design, sometimes we design too big. And so it's really thinking about, how do we scope that out for the right size?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much, Cameron.
Thank